Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the Pre-Socratics and the nature of reality. So hopefully you've already done the reading for the week, have a pretty good feel about why philosophy is said to begin with Thales, and have a rough idea about what's going on already before you start this lecture. But if you're a little lost, don't worry. Hopefully this will clear everything up. So, as discussed above on the module page, Thales is said to be the beginning of philosophy because he caused this shift in thinking. Right? This new tradition began with Thales. By predicting the solar eclipse in 585 BC, he was able to show that the nature of reality was quite a bit different than people at the time assumed it was. And so people at the time assumed that the gods had a good amount of control over nature. Things that occurred in nature, events that occurred in nature, such as weather, calamities, right, natural disasters, all of these things were a direct result of the actions of the gods. So if all of these things are up to the gods at their whims, right, then we shouldn't be able to predict them. But in predicting the solar eclipse, Thales showed that the gods aren't actually controlling these things at a whim. There must be some underlying structure to reality. And so Thales caused this shift so that now people after him and his contemporaries started asking, what is this underlying structure to reality? Can we figure out what the systematic layout is, and can we then from that start pulling predictions? If we can do that, then we can get a full understanding of the nature of reality, and things won't be so mysterious anymore. So, let's get into what they actually thought the nature of reality was. So I think it's really useful to think of this lesson, and much of philosophy, as a conversation that's occurring between philosophers. If you think of it in this conversational way, then you can always be anticipating what a reply might be or should be, right? And so you can start to already get an idea of what the next step is. Right? So I've structured this lecture in that conversational way. Right? So that's just a little tip going forward. Try and do that when you're reading. But yeah, let's start. So Thales thought that the fundamental unit for nature was water. How do we know this? Well, maybe you guys have seen this already in the text, but we have a lack of original text for all of these pre-Socratic philosophers. So a lot of what we rely on is fragments of a text or testimony from other philosophers at the time. So Aristotle's writing gives us this important information about what Thales thought. Now, why is this important? Well, it means you have to take everything with a grain of salt, right? So Aristotle could be misrepresenting Thales' view on purpose because he wants to use it as a foil, right? Say, hey, here's this ridiculous view we shouldn't believe. Now let's see how we can build on it. Or he might just be misinterpreting him by accident because he doesn't understand the view. Or this could just be exactly what Thales thought. We don't have irrefutable proof one way or the other. So always take that with a grain of salt. But that means that we can do the important job as thinkers of filling in the blanks or trying to make Thales' view as strong as we can. Not just Thales, obviously. This is a general thing, right? You should always be trying to make everybody's view as strong as it can be to see whether or not it holds up to your scrutiny. Okay, so Thales thought that the fundamental unit of nature was water. Why might he think this? So Aristotle said it has to be something about this idea that everything that exists gets its nutriment from moistness, from water, right? So he really focused on this idea of a seed growing and blooming. We get this life out of this seed because of moisture and water in the earth. And he thinks you can see that in everything. And then also just in the transformation that we already see, right? So from ice to water to vapor, excuse me, from ice to water to vapor, we can see this thing transforming. So now we can say, okay, well, water might be the fundamental nature of reality. How are we going to get to anything else? How are we going to get to fire? How are we going to get to earth and everything else we experience in the world? Well, at least with water, we get some evidence that it can easily transform. So not only does it seem to be necessary for the life we experience, but we get to see it transforming. So, just to make this clear, when Thales is saying the fundamental nature of reality, or the fundamental unit of reality is water, he's saying that at base, this is our fundamental particle. So this is going to sound a little silly to us now with all the advances we've seen in science, right? We know that water is made up of even further constituent parts. But essentially, Thales is trying the same project as modern physicists, right? They're trying to find the fundamental particle or the fundamental unit of reality. Thales was doing the same thing without all of the great technology and information that we have now, and he thought that the fundamental unit would be water. So how did he think water was going to transform from one thing to another, right? We see it go from ice to water to vapor, but how is it going to transform into these further things? How does water suddenly become the rocks we see in the mountains that are forming? And Thales thought that this transformation could happen through motion, right? So as water sped up or slowed down, it would turn into these different elements and thus be able to form the different objects we see in the world. So as water sped up, it would turn into fire. And then as it reached its sort of max speed, right, it would turn into air. And if it slowed down, it would start to dense and turn into stone or mountain or all the other types of earth that we see. So that's sort of Thales' rough view about what the nature of reality was. Now, remember, we have to think of this as a conversation. So Anaximander comes in after Thales and critiques Thales' view and says, well, I see what you're doing here, trying to understand the nature of reality by appealing to water. And I get why you were appealing to water, but we have a major problem with this view. Water is just too specific a unit, right? We need something more fundamental. Essentially what he's saying here is water is a particular thing that we already experience in the world. There's got to be something more fundamental that even explains that water in the first place. Right? So Anaximander is saying we can't just look at something in the world, pick that out and say, okay, that's our fundamental unit. We have to look beneath everything. We have to find something more fundamental that we can then use to explain everything we see, even water. And Anaximander came up with this idea of the boundless. And if in the reading the boundless seemed a little mysterious to you, that's okay. It should have. Essentially, it's this pre-stuff material, right? So it's not rock, it's not water, it's not fire, it's not any of those. It's some other substance that was before all of these other elements came into existence. And the boundless has eternal motion, right? So just think of this sort of spiraling matter, right? In the middle of nowhere, right? There's this spiraling matter spinning around and around in eternal motion. And then things break off, right? After it's spinning, little bits break off here and there, and those then start to form all of the things we actually see in the world, right? So water that we see today initially started out as just a piece of the boundless, but through the motion and the breaking off of a piece of the boundless, we get something like water. We get something like the mountains and fire and everything else we see in the world. And then from those, obviously, once we have all of the basic elements, then they think we can start to see more advanced forms of life starting to come from that. Right? So hopefully this is clear so far, because we get the next step pretty quickly here with Anaximenes. So the problem with Anaximander's view is that it's just too vague, right? So we already sort of mentioned this. This notion of the boundless is extremely vague. He doesn't give us any idea, really, of what it is in any concrete sense, right? He just says it's this substance that's in eternal motion. But he can't really do too much to describe this substance. So he leaves his theory very vague. And Anaximenes picks up on that. He says this is just too vague for us to believe in. And in addition to that, Anaximenes says, well, at least Thales' view gives us some reason to believe it. Right? We get to see water in action. We get to see all of these changes. We get to see it as sort of this necessary thing for life. With the boundless, we just have no reason to believe it exists. Essentially, it seems like Anaximander just pulled it out of thin air, right? Said, hey, I need something that's not water, that's pre-stuff, right? I need this fundamental substance. Let me just make something up. The boundless. And so Anaximenes thinks that's what Anaximander did. He thinks there's just no reason to believe in this boundless. You just seemingly made it up. You haven't really argued that it exists. You're just positing that it exists. And we need an argument. And so Anaximenes instead said, well, Thales and Anaximander are both mistaken. The actual fundamental unit is air. And so why? Well, once again, he appeals to very similar reasons to Thales. He says air is this thing that's absolutely necessary for life. We see the way in which humans obviously need air to live, but we also get to see air as something that's tangible everywhere, right? So not only are we interacting with the air at every moment, right? When you move your hand, you can feel the resistance against the air. You're constantly breathing. You feel the air conditioning blowing. You see the wind working against the trees, so on and so forth. You can just see that air is everywhere. And so Anaximenes took that as some evidence that air was the fundamental unit of nature. So how is air going to transform into something like a mountain, right? Into something like water or fire? Anaximenes posited that the way in which air changes into these other elements and then to everything else in the world is just by its level of density, right? So if we have air, we take air and we condense it, eventually it'll turn into fire. We condense it even further, we'll get water. We keep condensing it, we'll get stone and mountains and all the earth that we're looking for. Now think to yourself, if you were next in line, right? So if you're next in this conversation, what would you say to Anaximenes? So I would pause here and take a couple minutes just to think. You've seen how the conversation's working so far. What could you add at this point? Okay, hopefully you took some time to think. And then we get to Parmenides. So Parmenides is the next piece in this conversation. Parmenides claimed that all three of the previous views were incorrect because they all relied on this idea that things can change from one to another, right? So Thales thought that water could change into all the different elements. The boundless could change into all these different things. Air could change. Parmenides thought, well, change is actually just an illusion. There is no real change in the world. And so if we can't have change, then all of these previous philosophers must be mistaken. Now, in the next video, we'll actually talk about Parmenides' argument for why he thought there was no change. But that's a more advanced argument. We need some more time for that. Just for right now, what's important for you to remember is that Parmenides thought there was no change, and since all of the previous views depend on change, they must be incorrect. And then the final step is the atomists, and we'll start that in the next video.